I've got y'all in Hollywood Squares, so I can see you as you interact with me. And I'm going to keep you guys just muted for now, if you don't mind, and then it'll stay on me. But raise your hand. How many of you smell your hops before you throw them in your beer? Do you always do that, or do you just sometimes do that?
Every time.
Pretty much always?
Always.
Okay. How about like a yeast starter? Do you swirl a yeast starter and smell to see what it smells like?
No.
Sometimes.
How about your malt? Do you taste your raw grains before you brew?
Not all the time.
Do you smell your raw grains before you brew?
No.
Like at the brew store, and when I get it from Jim's house, yeah.
Especially if it's something I haven't used before.
Right.
I taste
Have
it.
you ever come up with a recipe and decided it was going to be like 75% pale, 25% crystal 60, and made like 3 grains and 1 grain and tasted them?
Oh.
Have I ever? Yes, I have done it a couple times, but I don't do it that often.
All right, get a little food for thought there. So I always think about taste your ingredients, especially grain, because grain goes stale very quickly. If you're buying it in bulk and you don't have the greatest storage container, it slowly oxidizes and it just tastes like old crackers and old biscuits and things like that, that you're eating crackers and you can just tell, man, this is old, this has had some moisture and it just is oxidized. And if you brew with that, it's not going to go away. It's going to be in your beer. So I encourage you all to taste your ingredients. And if you have different types of malts that you like to use, taste several of them. If you like Crystal 60 from Breeze, taste one from Great Western. They all have subtle differences. And you can brew a whole bunch of batches of beer and that takes forever, or you can taste a bunch of them and real quickly be like, wow, that's got a lot more flavor than this one does. So I think of it like cooking, that you wouldn't cook with things that you didn't know how old they were, if it was fresh milk, things like that. So I encourage you to taste your grains before you brew. But tonight what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what is malt, what are some of the variations in malt, and then we're going to taste these 9 samples and kind of can talk about what kind of flavors they're going to contribute to your beers and what kind of characters they're going to contribute. So the big thing is we're going to start with raw grains like barley and wheat. And barley is going to be the predominant grain that we're going to malt and then use in beer. And barley grows out in the fields. You've all seen a barley plant. And it starts out with malting. We're going to take these little seeds that want to become a barley plant. The whole idea, these little kernels, they want to go out into nature and become a plant. So they want to sprout, they want to grow. And so as a maltster, they're going to let them sprout and then dry them. And we're going to get a lot more into that. But the basic concept is we're going to let them start to grow and then we're going to stop them. And the reason why we're going to do that is because raw grain is just this hard little product of nature here that wants to protect its innards. It's got carbohydrates in there that as a brewer, we want to turn into sugars that then will ferment. But if it was just raw, it's too inaccessible and we can't get those sugars out. So what we want to do is use its natural tendency to just want to grow. And we're going to get it to grow a little bit so that it releases its fermentable and its non-fermentable components so that we can make beer. Because basically what we're doing is we're using fermentable sugars, we're adding yeast, we get alcohol. If we have unfermentable sugars or unfermentable extracts, we get body. Then the ratio of your fermented to your unfermenteds are going to give you the dryness or the sweetness of your beer. So just big picture, we want fermentables so that we get alcohol. We want some unfermentables so we have some body. And then depending on how dry or sweet we want it, we're going to formulate our recipe. So the malt itself is going to give us starchy carbohydrates that will become sugars. It's got proteins that are going to help these enzymes work in our mash. We've got nitrogen in there. And all of this is, our goal is to have a healthy environment for yeast, as well as fermentable sugars to get our alcohol. Barley also has a husk, and that husk helps our grain bed and it makes a natural filter. So we're not going to go through each one of these yet. I'm going to hold those off for a second. But if you just pull out one of the grains from like your Pilsner bag and you just kind of start looking at it, it looks like a hard little kernel. You can see the husk that's on the outside of it. If you look close, I'm middle-aged and I can't see real close anymore, but okay, there we go, better light. You can see there's a husk on it. You can pick it off with your fingernail if you really try. And that is protecting the interior where the starches and the sugars are going to be that we're going to use in our beer. The malt also gives us head retention to our beer, gives us body and mouth feel, and then depending on what grains we use, we contribute different kinds of flavors. So the maltster is going to start with picking out what kind of grain they want to use. And some terms you'll hear thrown around are 2-row or 6-row barley. And that's just a function of how it grows in nature. A 2-row barley, you'll see all these little, let's see if I get something back here. They grow up in twos on each side of the stalk. A 6-row barley grows with, again, if I can get here, 3 and 3. So up the stalk, you'd see 3 kernels, 3 kernels, 3 kernels on each side. So 6 going all the way around the center, or 2. It's just different types of barley varieties that are out there. 6-row tends to have a little higher protein level. So brewers that want to use corn and rice, like the Bud Miller Coors, that higher protein level helps them throw more rice and corn into their beer and get it to ferment. 2-row tends to be much more common in home brewing and in our in microbreweries and so forth. It's got more flavor, it's more expensive, but what it contributes to the beer then is we don't get that kind of grainy, husky flavor that comes out of 6-row. If you had a Budweiser right now and you were tasting it, or a Miller Lite or something like that, it has kind of a grainy harshness to it that 2-row doesn't have. So a little more expensive to get 2-row, but you get a lot more subtle flavors out of it. And it has more of what you expect in like a craft beer flavor instead of that micro or macro flavor. The next thing they're going to look at is what strain did they want to use. So you'll hear words like Maris Otter. That's just a strain of barley. Clagus, Harrington, Golden Promise. Go up to like Skagit Valley Malting and they've got all kinds of grains they're doing. So you've got, is it a 2-row or is it a 6-row? What kind of variety do you want to use? And then what kind of character are they looking for? Do they want a lot of protein? Do they want something that attenuates really well? Do they want something that doesn't? And then once they've selected their basic variety here of grain, they're going to malt it. And essentially what we're going to do is 3 steps to this little raw, this raw barley that's hard as a rock. We're going to soak it in water, and that's called steeping. So much like if you planted a seed in the ground and it wants to start to grow, it gets moist, it triggers its biochemical reaction to say, hey, we're ready to grow. Let's start, converting everything in our little seed and make it a plant. So the first step is they steep it. Then what they do is they germinate it. And all that really means is they're going to let it sprout. And so a little rootlet is going to grow out the back end of this little seed. And that little rootlet's going to grow out. And while that's doing it, it's taking the enzymes that are inside this little kernel and it's breaking down the cell walls that are protecting those carbohydrates. It's breaking down the proteins and it's helping that to release sugars, nutrients, and nitrogen. So the barley's getting soft now at this point. It's got its little rootlet and we now call this green malt. And the longer this goes on with time and temperature, you get more and more modification. So if you don't let it grow for very long, you have a smaller rootlet. If you let it grow longer, you have a longer rootlet. Again, think of a plant that's growing roots into the ground. You'll hear terms like well-modified malt or under-modified malt. Just about everything we buy today is well-modified. And all that really means is that the starches are going to be very accessible in the malt that you're buying. Under-modified, it's a lot harder to get those out of the grain. So then you need to do a more intensive mashing schedule maybe like a decoction or a multi-step mash to kind of help that grain let its starches go. So again, most of the things we buy are going to be well modified. You can do a single step mash unless you've got reasons for doing other things with it. But that's the germination stage. Next comes kilning. And kilning just means drying it out and stopping the growth. So they're going to add heat. It's going to drop the moisture content. The growth is going to stop, and that's going to preserve the enzymes. So I kind of think of this a little bit like they almost did a little mini mash and then stopped it. Now they want to give it to us to continue to mash it and take it the rest of the way. So the longer they kiln it and the hotter the temperature they kill it at, it's going to get darker and darker, and it's going to get richer flavors. But the longer they kiln it, the more of the enzymes they kill off. So big picture here, we have like a Pilsner malt that's really lightly kilned all the way up to our roasted malt that we're going to taste tonight that's almost char. So our Pilsner malt still has lots of its enzymes inside of it. Our roasted malt really doesn't have any. It's just in there for roast. So as you're choosing grains, the darker they are, the less enzymes you're going to have. So then thinking about color. Color in malt is defined by degrees Lovibond. It's just a scale, and it's not related to SRM, that's beer color. You'll hear beer color things with SRM, you'll hear malt in degrees Lovibond. And in malt, you have ranges from like 1 to 600. So like a real pale Pilsner like we've got here is probably like a 1 or a 2 degrees Lovibond. That roasted one we have is probably like 400 degrees Lovibond, all the way up to like 600, which is just black. So if we compare kind of the two scales of beer color and malt color, they don't relate to each other. They're two different scales, they're tested, and that's how they come up with these numbers. But like an opaque black beer is going to be about 40 SRM. A black malt is going to be like 600 degrees Lovibond. So again, 640, no relation to each other, but just something to think about as you're formulating a recipe, that the degrees Lovibond, you're going to want to use software to kind of guess what color you're going to get out of your final beer, or you can calculate it by hand if you're nutty, but most of us are going to use software. So malt gets categorized into two basic categories. We've got our base malts, and everything else is a specialty malt. So our base malts are typically going to be like 80 to 100% of our grain bill. Those have enough enzyme potential in them to convert all their own starches into sugars. They're going to provide fermentable sugars, flavor, nitrogen. They're typically going to be lightly kilned, so not going to contribute a lot of color. And on the other side, we're going to have specialty malts. And specialty malts get broken down into two categories. We're going to have kind of the crystal or the caramel malts. We'll talk about those in a bit. And then we're going to have the kilned and the roasted malts. And so that's just kind of a differentiation of what happens to those once we've germinated them. So I'm going to start with our base malts here. And if you guys want to pull out some of your Pilsner malt, think about Pilsner beer. Somebody have a question? Nope, okay. Think about like a German Pilsner beer. And if you've had a good German beer that's fresh, you can just kind of smell that graininess. That's the Pilsner malt. It's a real lightly colored. These are like going to be like 1 to 2 degrees Lovibond. They're kilned at about 185 degrees, not very long, just long enough to dry them out. Grab 2 or 3 of them and just kind of look at them. And as you have your bags out there, you'll notice that a lot of these look pretty similar because the most of these are barley. The one that's going to look a little different is the wheat bag. That's going to look a little more plump. We'll get to that one. But looks wise, you can see it's a light color compared to some of these other darker ones that you've got laying out there. If you smell it in the bag, it smells like the bag. So pull it out of the bag. Do you guys smell anything?
No.
And feel free to unmute here. We'll just kind of chat together. Pretty light. I mean, if you really had to press there, you might say, yeah, maybe some water cracker or something, but not much at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I want you to do is take a small little grouping of them, put them in your mouth, chew them up a bit, let your saliva kind of work on them, and think about the texture of it. Did it just crumble in your mouth? Was it kind of hard? Did it want to shatter? Is it kind of more like flour? Is it more kind of mealy? I'm going to join here.
Definitely, it's kind of like fell apart. I wouldn't say like cracker, but like a softer grain. And I usually eat them, so yeah.
Let's all unmute here and we're just going to kind of throw stuff out.
Seem to fall apart relatively easily, you know, when you chewed on it a little bit.
So I want to go back about 45 years ago. I used to farm with my grandparents and aunts and uncles in Idaho, and they used to grow barley and wheats. And raw barley you could put in your mouth and chew on it. It would turn into gum. It would turn into a real gummy texture, and you could literally take a mouth full of barley and chew on it for, you know, an hour or two, because it would just get gummy. This stuff here, it's all dried out. It disintegrates pretty quickly.
So a Pilsner malt is going to give you a real neutral base grain. You could make a beer 100% out of Pilsner malt. Think like Bohemian Czech Pils. That's going to be 100% or almost 100% if they decide not to use 100%. So you're going to have just this really clean malt bill. Nothing to hide behind there. No big flavors to overwhelm. So you could make a super, super clean beer out of this. As we get into the darker malts, we'll start to talk about how those flavors then start to change what your base beer becomes. So this Pilsner malt is going to mostly ferment. It's going to leave a little bit of residual sugar, but not a whole lot. It's not going to contribute a whole lot to body. So you're going to get kind of the crackery flavors, kind of saltines. Sometimes it could come off as a little green or a little grassy, depending on the brand you buy. I'm kind of a Pilsner malt anal retentive person, that I love Weyermann malt. I just love Weyermann Pilsner malt. I think it just has this really fresh, crisp taste to it. Some of the Americans still taste fine, but head to head, it just kind of seems like they're really lacking.
Who manufactured the pills that we're tasting now?
Great Western.
Okay.
I was going to say, Jim sent me my cheat sheet here, and I think just about everything is Great Western until I tell you otherwise.
Okay.
So the Pilsner is Great Western, so that's going to be a North American malt. If you like brewing with Pilsner malts, I would encourage you to try a number of different Pilsner malts because they all taste slightly different. And you may love Great Western. That may hit right what you like. I'm not saying you have to love Weyermann. I do. And I've tried lots of other ones and I just don't think it tastes the same. If you don't like the expense of Weyermann, RAR, R-A-H-R, I believe. RAR is another one that's a little less expensive, but I think it comes in pretty close to Weyermann. Great Western's probably gonna be about half the price of Weyermann. Jim can probably chime in on that, but I brew infrequently enough that I try to spend as much money on really good ingredients to make sure that if I'm brewing a Munich Dunkel or something, I'm going to want Weyermann malt. If I'm brewing an English beer, I'm going to want English malt. If I'm brewing an American beer, it'll depend on what I'm trying to do, but I try not to just have like one base malt that I use in all my beers. Just my philosophy, but I don't brew a whole lot. I'll brew 6 times a year or something like that. So I usually buy one-off ingredients and brew that batch of beer. And I don't have, 55 pounds of whatever I just bought and I'm using it in every beer. So just a philosophy thing, but each grain that you use, know what it tastes like and taste it. And I think, I won't say anything for Jim here, but I'm sure if you ordered 10 pounds of something from Jim and said, hey, could I just get like a little spoonful and a little baggie of this other grain? I'm curious, I've never brewed with such and such. So you taste the Gambrinus ESB malt versus the Briess, and you go, oh yeah, those taste about the same. I guess I don't really care what I brew with. Or you might say, wow, I love how that tastes. I want to try making a beer with this and see how it comes out. There are so many varieties. So Todd was talking about, you go into a malt store and there's everything. So where do you start? It's like going into, a craft beer store and you've never had a craft beer. What do you pick? You need to just kind of start with a recipe and pick a base malt. We're going to make a German beer. Let's start with Pilsner. We're going to make an American pale ale. Let's start with just a 2-row pale ale. We'll pick our ingredients and continue to brew that beer. If you just brew one beer and then never brew it again, or 10 years later you brew it again, you haven't really dialed in what your grains are doing for that beer. If you make the beer and you decide, yeah, it came out kind of thin, what could I do? You might want to adjust like one thing in your malt bill. You might want to adjust one thing on how you mash, because the temperature you mash at is going to change where your fermentables come in. And I'm not going to talk about that tonight because that's a whole other complex topic, but you have some levers to turn as you're trying to dial your beer in. But it's going to all start with the grain. It's never going to be better than the grain you start with. If you start with stale grain, it's never going to taste super fresh and crisp. It's going to taste like, yep, I probably should have bought some new grain. But within all of these, we have so many manufacturers that nobody's ever going to brew with all of them. So it's pick one or two, see if you like them, see if you like one versus the other. And just kind of keep, each time you use, oh, I've got a recipe that I want some ESB malt, pick one, taste it. Maybe pick some other ones up from Jim and taste those raw and be like, it's got a lot more flavor. Yeah, tastes about the same. I don't care. Check that off the list. I'm never going to worry about what ESB malt I buy anymore.
That's one thing I like about going to brew conferences is you can go to the different manufacturers and taste all their grains. That's a big bonus about to go to one of those.
I think of it like cooking. There's better flours out there. Will can probably talk for days on flours, but you can buy the cheapest grocery store flour, or you can buy like the King Arthur high protein flour, and they're going to act differently. And you get to know those ingredients and you decide if it's worth the money or not. And so each grain you choose, you can either be, I want to order this specific grain every time. So when you order from Jim, it's okay. I want that Great Western Pilsner Malt you've got. And he'll say if he's got it or not, and off you go. If you're like, Jim, I really want the such and such, he can tell you, oh yeah, I can order that for you. Or no, you're gonna have to get that from somewhere else. But if you just go in and always say, I'll take whatever your 2-row is, you don't really know what you're brewing with. And so from beer to beer, you're like, why is this beer different than last time? Well, last time you got Great Western. This time you got, I'll pick one off Jim's list here. You got the such and such. You had Briess 2-row. Last time you had Great Western 2-row. They're going to be slightly different. They're going to behave slightly different. And your recipe is going to be slightly different. So think about if you were going to go into a bar and order a beer, you're a beer geek. You don't just say, give me a beer. You say, oh, I'd like that Deschutes Porter. You're getting the Deschutes Porter. So I think a grain like that. I'll get off my high horse there, but think about your ingredients and think about them like they're specific. So ask for specific grains, brew with specific grains, and then next time what grains you used. So in your recipe logs, put in that was Briess 2-row, or that was Gambrinus 2-row, and then next time. All right, we are going to move on to the pale ale malt here. If you take a look at your pale ale malt that came, take a look at how that looks next to the Pilsner malt. Do they look the same or different? Color-wise, size-wise?
Slightly darker.
Very slightly darker.
Can you hold them up to the camera, Lori? Maybe?
I don't think they'll show. I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
No.
So our Pilsner malt was probably in the 1 to 2 degrees Lovibond range. Our pale ale malt is probably in like the 2 to 4 degree Lovibond range. So on the giant scale of, 0 to 600 Lovibond, 1 to 600 Lovibond, you're in a pretty minute little change here, but they are slightly different. Your pale ale malt's going to be just ever so slightly darker. It's kilned at just a slightly higher temperature. They probably kilned the pills at about 185. They probably kilned this at about 220, a little bit longer. And let's do the same thing here. Let's look at it. It pretty much looks like the Pilsner Malt did. And let's taste it.
It's funny. The first thing that stepped out for me was there was like a little bit of a green flavor at the end of the Pilsner, and that seems to be less prominent in the pale.
I think the pale is sweeter.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Mhm.
I agree.
Definitely picking up more flavor.
Much more flavor, much sweeter.
Yeah.
I get almost like a graham cracker kind of hint in this one.
Mhm.
I didn't want to be the one to say graham cracker. Totally agree.
A little tiny bit sweeter, a little graham crackery.
A little bit more of a crunch.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So pale ale malt, another base malt here. This is typically done in English style beers. So this would probably be traditionally, pale ale malt would have been grown in England. And in America, a lot of times we would just spec out for our base malts here. We would just call them like 2-row malt. Typically just, if you were gonna order pale ale, if you're gonna get pale ale. If you just generically said, hey, Jim, get me some 2-row, what do you supply, Jim?
That would be Great Western 2-row pale.
Okay. So we have pale ale here, a little bit darker. We got that kind of little graham crackery thing. Think English style pale ales. And if you like to brew English bitters, special bitters, ESBs, I would use pale ale malt instead of just generic 2-row for the reason we're kind of finding here. It's got just kind of that little hint of graham cracker, that little hint of sweetness. There's just something slightly different. And if you brewed a 2-row like English bitter and you brewed a pale ale or pale ale malt, pale ale, you'll taste just kind of this subtle complexity that you can't really put your finger on. It's not going to jump out at you, but it's got that just little something in there. And I think it really makes an English style pale ale jump out if you get the pale ale malt.
So Lori, you're also talking about using the pale ale, but use a English manufacturer. Don't use Great Western, but use what?
I would try whatever you like. If I was doing it, I would probably try to get like Castle is one of my favorite continentals. I don't even know if Castle is truly, they might be in Belgium. I'm not sure if they're in England or Belgium, but I tend to buy ingredients from whatever country I'm brewing the beer. It's just my wonky quirkiness. But any kind of pale ale, same kind of thing. If you like making English pale ales, try this one. If you like how it comes out, maybe sample a different one that Jim can get or a different one that you can order online and see how those taste and then decide which one you like, and that kind of becomes your recipe. And I always kind of think as a home brewer that I'm always trying to like hit the ideal. If I'm trying to brew to style, I try to brew to style. If I'm just trying to make a mutt beer and I don't really care, it's like I want something malty and I've got these hops in my fridge. I'm not trying to like nail the perfect pale ale. If I was trying to nail the perfect English pale ale, I'd start with probably an English manufacturer of English pale ale. And I'd buy a yeast that's got some English characteristics to it and English hops and on and on and on. Just my preference. Next one up we're gonna try is Maris Otter. And
Laura,
Maris Otter,
Question real quick,
yeah.
Vicky. Can we
Yep,
go
gotcha.
back for a second? So is Pilsner malt a slightly kilned 2-row? Is that what you're saying? Is it like, so it's, what's the difference between just 2-row when we go into a store and we buy a bag of 2-row and like Pilsner malt?
That's a good question. I don't know that I have a good answer for that. Pilsner malt is starting from a 2-row.
Mhm.
And so I've always felt like a two-row supplier maybe doesn't always use the same grain variety. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I think about if you were making, I'm trying to think of a food analogy here, but if you were making bulk wine and all you had to do is have Merlot, you're just going to buy Merlot grapes and you don't care. If you're going to be a little more boutique about it, you might want to have Merlot grapes that came from Red Mountain in Washington State. I don't know if that's factoring in on just the manufacturers that make just a ton of two-row. If they're just getting, Harrington malt, Clages malt, those would be two varieties of barley that would be very well grown all over the United States. Pilsner malt, I have no idea. I'll have to look that up. I'll get back to you on that one because that's my curiosity.
We have we have bags that are they're labeled two-row.
Right.
But then we also have Pilsner malt. We have what do you call it? Pilsen. Mm-hmm. And so then it made me just start thinking, well, I have no idea what the difference is. At least when you get to pale, I can tell the difference because it's a little bit more roasted.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here to take a shot at this. Okay. Basically, most of these are two-row barley. Mm-hmm. There is a six-row barley, which is rare, but your Pilsner malt is going to be a two-row. It's just kilned differently than the pale malt. And we tend to say two-row, and we mean pale malt. They're all two-row. So anyway, you're either getting Pilsner malt, you're getting pale malt, et cetera, et cetera.
It's the kilning. It's how much it's being roasted.
But, and I totally get that part. It's just, I guess, is Pilsner malt that, it is two-row. Is
Correct.
It just, is there a difference between something labeled just two-row and something labeled Pilsner?
So then you want to look at the malt. There's a spec sheet that goes with malt. You can find online generically for any maltster, or you can get a batch specific. Like if you were a big brewery, you'd get a list that comes with your malt, and you'd have all kinds of information on there with diastatic power and all kinds of things that we're not going to get into, but that would tell you a lot more about it, and it'd tell you exactly what degree Lovibond it's coming in at.
And that's the main thing that I've noticed buying all my stuff from Jim is the Pilsen malt and the two-row and the pale malt. My assumption was they were all pale, they were all two-row malt, but all of the Lovibonds were different.
And that's correct. Each one of these is going to have a slightly different Lovibond.
So I'm going to jump in here one more time. Two-row is when you get two-row malt, that's just shorthand for two-row pale malt.
But pale malt also has a different connotation in British brewing. So a manufacturer may sell a two-row base malt. They may also sell a different product that's a pale ale malt. And pale ale malt will be slightly different than just two-row base malt.
Yeah.
And then you want to look at those degree Lovibond and decide what kind of coloring you want.
Yeah.
Now, in America, the variety they're going to start with is probably going to be like Clages, Harrington. You may see that on a bag of grain. The next one we're going to taste is Maris Otter. Maris Otter is just a two-row grain, but Maris Otter, much like Clages and Harrington, is a specific variety. So this is just a two-row base malt, but Maris Otter. And it grows at a lower yield. So when a farmer makes this or decides to grow this, they don't get as good of a yield. So they charge more. And people will buy it because now when you taste Maris Otter compared to the pale, see if you can taste a difference.
There's a lot more flavor. Almost like it would give a fuller body to your beer because it's that much more.
Like a little caramel note.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
It seems more roasty too.
I get a shockingly large amount of roast for such a pale malt.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I didn't look at it, I'd be like, This is Crystal 20 or something like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
you
I think the
still get,
caramel's really coming through.
as you crunch on it, you still get kind of a floury center. When we get to the crystal malts, we'll talk about how those kind of present differently. But these, as you chew, you still kind of get some flour.
It also seems more husky. Like there's
Yeah, a
more
little bit.
husk in my mouth than there was when I was eating the other ones.
So same thing with Maris Otter. If you want to brew a pale ale with it, it's going to have a lot of flavor. If that's what you want in your pale ale, use it. If you like English ales and you want a little more malt character, use it. It is more expensive because it has lower yields and brewers like it. But it's a choice you can make. You can decide for yourself if it's helping or hurting the beer you're doing. I love it for flavor. I think it just has just distinct, I hate to use the word generic malty, but to me, this grain just screams malty. It's just.
It's
Lori,
delicious.
can I ask Jim, what's the price difference from a pale to a Maris Otter? Is it 20 cents a pound or 10 cents a pound?
35 cents a pound.
So for a 10-pound batch, we're talking $3.50 more.
Correct.
$3.50
worth
versus
it.
$1.
It's worth it.
And that's where my philosophy comes in on brewing beers. If I'm going to spend all day making something and it's $5 more for ingredients, I'm spending $5 more for ingredients.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'm going to throw in here a little digression quickly. Great Western does make one called High Color, which is their version of a Maris Otter. When I did a brew, I did 7 brews a couple of years ago, and we did them all side by side. It was, excuse me, husk.
COVID.
It was very similar to Maris Otter.
Drink more beer.
At the same price of bacon.
Jim's
So
coughing.
Jim, several years ago, Jim, when we did that, we were doing an ESB with like 6 or 7 different malts, and 2 or 3 of them were very rich, very malty. So you're talking about the Maris Otter and then this other one that you carry or you can get. Those are the
Right.
2 that I think were in the middle that were better.
But we'll get back to it.
So now that we're having some grain, have some water. Next up, we're going to taste the Munich. Munich is the, I'm sitting here drinking a Paulaner Märzen. And without digressing into styles, the new Oktoberfest is much lighter. The old traditional Oktoberfest was Märzen, and it's got that orangey copper color, and it's lots and lots of Munich malt in it. So it's a great example if you happen to be drinking an Oktoberfest that's brewed with Munich malt. It smells, when I think, oh, a malty beer, what would I want? I think Märzen just really highlights the Munich malt. So Munich malt is also kilned at around 220, which would be similar to your pale ale malts, but they cure it longer and it develops a little more color. And
It's like a Munich 10.
Munich malts come in like 10 to 20. And I don't know which one, Jim. I think we probably got like the 10 just by looks. Jim's shaking his head, yeah. The 10 is going to be a little more subtle in your beer. The ones that drift closer to 20 really have some almost caramely characteristic to them, and they can quickly overwhelm. So if I was brewing an Oktoberfest, I'd stick down closer to like that 10-degree Lovibond. I might throw just a little splash in of the closer to 20 just to give a little interest. Anybody that's tasted my Oktoberfest this year, it's got just a little bit of 20 in there to give it kind of that almost caramely hint in there. But that 10-degree one, you get this nice subtle maltiness. Munich malt's one you can throw in your pale ales in just tiny little percentages, like 2-3%. And if you're brewing pale ales and you're like, man, I just kind of don't have any malt character in this pale ale, throw just a little hint of Munich malt in there. And all at once, you've got kind of that, again, generic malty term, but it kind of builds out a little more depth in your pale ale. So let's taste this one. This one's a little crunchier.
Good.
GEBL is not responsible for any chipped teeth this evening.
Yeah, not our insurance plan.
What are you guys tasting in this one?
So it gets a little bit bready.
I thought I got a little bit of a caramel note to me.
Very much so.
Which
Almost
one are
like
we on?
pretzels
Dean?
that have kind of that outer coating on a pretzel.
Quick question. Which one are we on again?
Unit.
Munich.
Okay.
Munich.
I want to make sure we're not jumping ahead.
This is good. I like this one.
Yeah, I like this one too.
This one gets you kind of bread crusts and just that depth of malt in there. Great malt to throw into any beer that you're trying to just kind of give it that generic malty.
But you wouldn't use more than just a few percent of this in a beer?
Well, if I was doing, you could make 100% Munich malt beer. If you were gonna do that, I would use like the 10-degree Lovibond one. If you do the 20% Lovibond one, it would be pretty cloying. But you could use this. This is a base malt. You could use it for 100% of your recipe.
Okay, so it is a base malt.
This is a base malt. So
Okay,
the
cool.
ones we've had so far are all base malts here. Pilsner, Pale, Maris Otter, which is a 2-row. They're all 2 rows, and a Munich. The next one we're going to have is wheat, and that's also a base malt. So again, all of our base malts have enough enzymes to convert all their starches to sugars to become beer. So let's taste the wheat malt. And as you look at the wheat malt, you'll notice it looks different than all the rest of these. So instead of starting with barley, they've started with wheat. And the same thing, we've probably all seen wheat growing in a field. Looks a lot like barley from afar.
So before chewing on these, wheat is a very hard grain. We don't want to be responsible for your teeth.
So before you chomp down on this, as Jim's saying, what I do with wheat malt is I let it sit in my mouth for a little bit, but I'm going to talk, so I'm not going to do that. So if you guys want to pop some of these in your mouth and just kind of don't chew them yet, just kind of let the saliva do its thing. Just kind of swirl it around your mouth. But it does not have a husk. And you can tell just by looking at it, there's no husk compared to our barley. So if you were going to brew with this, you might want to use some rice hulls. Rice hulls just act like grain husk, and they help to keep your mash draining. If you just go with a high percentage of wheat, it's a very gummy, much like, was it Tom talking about eating raw grain? Wheat is just this gummy mess. And so if you get too much of it, you can get this gummy mess in the bottom of your mash tun. It just does not want to drain. So if you throw like in a 5-gallon batch, maybe a pound of rice hulls, it should just drain right through, no problem. So this has a little higher protein content than the barleys. So that's going to give us a little more body in our beer. It's going to help with foam or head retention, but it's also going to create some haze. So if we think about like a German wheat beer, pretty hazy. They use wheat malt in hazy beers. Wit beer, again, it's not going to be crystal clear because of all that protein haze. So they're going to kiln this one really low, maybe like 100 degrees. And it's going to end up being in that like 1.5 to maybe 4-ish Lovibond range. And I would say this one's probably 2 to 3, somewhere in there, hard to say. But as you guys are kind of getting this going, I'm going to let you think about it and talk, and I'm going to do the same thing.
So is there such a thing as wheat is roasted at different degrees Lovibond? Can you get a wheat of 10, a wheat of 15? I mean, you're talking about this is
wheat at 500.
Say what?
You can get midnight wheat at 500.
The midnight wheat.
Wow.
There's a crystal wheat too.
Okay.
That I think kicks up to like 60, I'm pretty sure.
And then I think David might have been going to get some toasted wheat that he had. Did you pick that up, David? Okay, so that one's a very dark one.
Yeah.
Cool.
It's well toasted.
So you're tasting along with it. You're just going to get toast at this point, but feel free to look at that.
Yeah.
But, so this
Where we use that, the toasted wheat.
in a Dunkelweizen. So maybe you're making a German Hefeweizen, but you want to make a dark one, Dunkelweizen. And then Greece has done like these midnight wheats. And there's another one that's got kind of a similar name that's kind of in that realm. And they're trying to get color and flavor without astringency as well. Did you guys notice as you chewed this one up, it has a totally different texture?
Yep.
Once you kind of got that outer shell to soften in your mouth, it's very flour-like. Got kind of like an uncooked bread dough thing going on. You guys getting anything that you want to share?
Yep.
Yeah, it definitely got gummy as it kind of dissolved. You chewed
Yeah.
a little bit, kind of stuck together and congealed in this mass.
The flavors are definitely a little less complex than the barley malts.
Oh, yeah.
For me, it's very much kind of like raw flour, maybe an uncooked bread dough. Okay, so that's our base malts. We went through 5 base malts. Again, you could use 100% of these in a beer if you wanted to. Some beer styles are going to come out better or worse if you were to do that. But you could make a Pilsner malt, a Pilsner beer out of 100% Pils. If you're going to make a wheat beer, like a German wheat, I would probably go like 60-40 wheat and the rest Pils, just to, again, have a little bit of watering ability and not just be a total hazy mess. Maris Otter you might buy if you're trying to get a little more flavor in there. Munich, definitely just a hint of it in a beer that like a pale ale. Throw just a little tiny percentage in there and you'll get a little characteristic out of it. Making a Märzen, you might use like 40% Munich. Balance that out with some Pilsner and maybe some other specialty malts. But those are going to be your base malts that if you go into your brewing software and you're calculating what your expected gravity is, those are the ones that are going to give you most of your gravity points. They have the most enzymes in them, the most starches that will convert to sugars, and that's where so that's why they're called base malts. Everything else is considered a specialty malt. And as I was saying, we have specialty malts that are crystal malts or caramel malts, same thing. Or we have the kilned and the roasted malts. So specialty malts are going to add flavors. They're going to add color, and they're going to add some unfermentables that add body. So we don't have any of the enzymes that we really need for brewing. So you couldn't make a beer that's going to turn out very good with 100% Crystal 60. You just don't have the fermentables. You get some color, you'll get something, but it's not going to be what you're expecting as a beer. It just doesn't have the fermentables. So these get used in smaller percentages to build out what we've decided we want to make for a beer. So say we're going to make a pale ale, and we've decided American pale ale, we're going to use generic 2-row for 80% of the malt bill. But we want to have, maybe we want to have just a little hint of some kind of color in it. We don't want it to just turn out pale. So we're going to pick a crystal malt. And not knowing anything, we're going to pick Crystal 60. Say, hey, let's throw some Crystal 60 in there, 5% Crystal 60. That'll give it some color. Plugged into the brewing software, and it says, yeah, that'll give it some color. So that's 5%. So I guess we could up our whole base malt and make it 95% base malt, 5% Crystal 60, see where that goes. That would turn out as a beer. It would ferment, it would have gravity. Probably wouldn't be my first choice of my recipe, but it's a place to start. So if I'm going to formulate a recipe, I tend to look at magazines, look at books, do a little research, come up with what I want, and then look at what grains I want to plug in for that. And recipes that just say, use a pound of this, 2 pounds of that, 8 pounds of that, I start to think about it as percentages. And if we know it's going to be like 75% pale ale and 25% other things, you can start to kind of dial in, okay, I have 20%, 25% of something to work with. What flavors am I trying to get with that remaining malt bill? Am I trying to make this beer become roasty? Am I trying to make it become caramely? Do I want it to just kind of have a fuller body so that when it ferments out, it's not 008, it's 1016. The choice in your specialty malts play into that. We're going to start with talking about Crystal 60 here. And caramel malts, Crystal 60 is one of the caramel malts. You'll hear them called crystal malts, caramel malts, interchangeable. But basically, once they got steeped, then they germinated, they let them stay wet. And at that point, they're kind of doing a little mini mash. And while they're still wet, the starches and the proteins are converting sugars and amino acids so that they're ready to contribute to your beer. So the green malt's kept moist. It's then dried and roasted. And so that's going to kind of liquefy the sugar that's inside this grain, and then it's going to caramelize it or crystallize it. So you're going to have your outer grain shell, and instead of having like the doughy, floury stuff that we've had in our other ones, we're going to now have like crystallized sugar. So it's kind of gone through this little mini mash at the maltster. When we throw it in our recipe now, we get caramelized sugar. So these come by degrees Lovibond, and they usually start out in the range of like 10 to 15 is about as low as you can find one, all the way up to about 150. And the lower numbers from like 60 and below tend to be a little cleaner. The ones that are starting to get over 60 quickly overwhelm what you throw them in. And you can't do math and come up with this. So you're doing a recipe and then you needed a little bit of 60. Can we use half as much of 120? Won't be the same. It's not linear. As you go over 60, your percentages you need keep going less and less because it's bold, it's in your face, and it's there. So I would use crystal malts in like the 60 or less for beers I want to throw them in. Beers that have recipes that call for like 150, 120, I look at those real carefully and think, are they just throwing a splash in here because they had it in their basement, or did they really want this particular flavor? So let's taste this one. This is Crystal 60. And
Very hard.
I was going to say, Shelly just nailed it. See how it just kind of shatters? If your dental work is good, see if you can bite it in half. And then look at what's left.
Interesting. It's a little bitter.
Mm-hmm.
Like bitter, but it's also got that caramely sweet flavor, but it's mostly bitter.
It definitely has a burnt flavor to it. I know brewers might want to use a different word than burnt, but that's what I
Oh,
got.
it's caramelized.
Yeah, the beginning of some
I see
chocolate.
like a darker caramel. That's
Yeah,
Extra toasty.
little chocolate coming out. Yeah.
at the very end. Yeah, right.
A little bit.
I like that.
So Crystal 60 is one of those that you can use in your recipes, but you're kind of on that range of, if you use too much of it, it's going to overwhelm.
Right.
If you just want a little of this flavor, pick a lower Crystal 40, Crystal
Wow,
50.
that's good.
If you want a lot of it, just be careful using it. Depending on the roast, you'll get anything from kind of honey to maybe caramel, then like toffee, and you go into like burnt sugar. And then some of them you even get like dried fruit, kind of a raisin, plum, prune. I get a little raisin in this one. And different producers of these, just like all of them, they're all going to have slightly different flavors. So if you always buy a certain brand, you get to know that brand, you know if you like it or not, you know how it performs in your beer. If you switch brands, it's going to be slightly different, just something to be aware of. Then crystal malts oxidize quickly. So if you're a brewer that transfers stuff from vessel to vessel and isn't the greatest about keeping oxygen out, I would be careful using too much crystal malt. It's one of the first malts that will oxidize. And if you're brewing a beer that you want to last for a long time, I wouldn't put a lot of crystal in it. One brewer that I think uses way too much Crystal 60 is Sierra Nevada. And you can taste just about every Sierra Nevada beer and it tastes like Crystal 60. And if you don't drink it fast enough, it tastes like oxidized Crystal 60. So something to play around with, but it's one of those that you could smell it in an oxidized beer right away. It's just like, oh man, they use Crystal 60 and it's an old beer. It's a little judging note there. If you're gonna enter a beer, make sure it's fresh. So again, this is gonna give you a little bit of color, a little bit of sweetness, and a little bit of body. So this is not gonna have a whole lot of fermentables in it. So you're putting it in there because you want to get that sugary, caramely, toasty, burnt sugar character in your beer. In small doses, it'll be subtle. In big doses, you'll really notice it. So those are these caramelized. So we've caramelized the sugars inside the grain. Next up, we're going to have kilned roasted malts. So these go through the same process, but
Can I ask a quick question?
you can.
So we have the crystal malts, which kind of, like you said, that mini mash where it caramelizes inside the shell. How is the crystal different than like the Cara Munich, Cara Vienna, Cara Hells, Cara Pils? Is that the same kind of thing?
They're all caramelized malts, and a lot of those are proprietary. So you'll have like Breeze makes one and Environment makes one, but the same kind of thing. They're taking that malt and they are crystallizing those sugars in it. Anybody else have any questions at this point? Okay, these next three we're going to go through pretty quickly here if you're starting to get bored, but we will finish strong here. These highly kilned or roasted malts are going to be produced very similar here with, they're going to steep them, they're going to germinate them, then they're going to dry them at a really high heat. And again, the longer they heat them or roast them, the darker and the more flavor you're going to get out of them. So toasting at this point, think of it like making toast in your toaster. You put your slice of bread in, and the sugars in your bread have amino acids, and when you heat them, they start to become toast. So as you barely toast a piece of bread, you have very little toast. As you keep toasting it longer and longer, it gets darker and darker until it smokes. So same kind of thing with malting. We can just barely toast them, or we can really toast them to the point where we're almost igniting the malt. So we're going to go from victory here in our tasting to chocolate, all the way to roasted. Now the victory and the chocolate are going to go through the steeping, the germination, and then they're going to roast them. The actual roasted malt here, they don't even bother to steep it or germinate it. They take raw barley, so it's unmalted barley, and they're just going to roast the heck out of this. And there's no reason to steep it and germinate it and go through all that time of developing things, because you're just going to roast the crap out of it and there's nothing left anyway. So that one is going to be just for roast flavor. It's not going to contribute any kind of enzymes. It's not going to contribute any kind of fermentables to your beer. It's just in there for flavor.
It's good if you want to add a little color, like to a red beer. Just add like a handful, 3 ounces or something like that.
So the first one we're going to taste is Victory. And I think Victory is proprietary to Breeze. At least it was way back when, but other people might make it now. But in any case, I think Victory has a registered after Victory. But it's going to be, again, this is a 2-row.
One kernel is enough.
I'm going to go 3 and we'll see where we get.
I don't know. I like it.
Yeah, it starts out tasting like your base malt, but then you get that bitter, more roasted flavor at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Did you guys get kind of a nutty thing in this one?
Yeah.
Ooh,
It's
yeah,
nutty.
that roasty flavor kind of creeps up on you.
Kind of like unsalted peanuts in there or something?
Yeah.
Oh, like the shell.
I can see that.
I find in the beer that the Victory really adds a toastiness, like a toasted bread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Victory is a great one to again use in small quantities in a lot of beers. It'll give you just that little kind of hint of nuttiness, roastiness that's kind of, again, it's not hitting you in the face like, oh, they threw this in. It's just a little something subtle to add. I was reading about this malt because I don't use it a whole lot, but a number of people were saying that if you overuse it, it tastes like unsweetened peanut butter. And the malt book that's, again, we'll pimp the GEBL library here. I think it's Jen Talley, who's at, I can't remember what brewery she's at anymore. I think she was the one that said that for the first time, was this unsweetened peanut butter thing. And I've tasted that in a beer before, and I just kind of wonder, but then continuing to read, it was several other brewers were like, yeah, if you use too much of it, you get like this peanut butter character in your beer. So if you're trying to make a peanut butter beer, that might be the one to start with, but something interesting there. So then the chocolate malt. The chocolate malt that we are tasting is, it's like a 300 to a 375 Lovibond. So it's kind of in the middle of chocolate. You can get Belgian chocolate malt. You can get, every brand makes one. Go ahead and smell that one, look at it, taste it. These have dried out.
Very bitter.
Kernel looks a little smaller.
Hits me with coffee up front.
Kind of light burnt coffee, like
light burnt.
Yeah, I can't get past the coffee flavor on this one.
Bitter.
So this is another malt. You're not going to need very much quantity, even if you're trying to make, something, a dark chocolatey porter or something. We're talking just small percentages, definitely under 5. You're not going to want, 20% chocolate malt, or you're just going to have this like acrid, and it's going to fight with any hops you have in there. So just subtle chocolate flavors, using small amounts there. Little water break. All right, the roasted malt. You're definitely going to want water after this one. So this is roasted barley. Think like a dry Irish stout, Guinness stout. This is kind of the signature malt that's in there. Again, really small quantity. Kilned at super high temps, so there's really nothing left of it other than what came out of the kiln here. What are you guys tasting?
Very nutty.
Mount St. Helens ash.
Yeah.
I'm surprised these kernels are as big as they are for as burnt as this tastes.
This particular one's super acrid to me. Man, it's
yeah.
So again, if you're making a dry Irish stout, you're not putting much of this in there, but you need it. You need some of it to get that roast flavor that you're expecting out of that beer. So now we're going to do something fun here. If you guys hang with me for just 5 or 10 minutes. You guys doing okay?
Yeah, this is good.
So let's play Make a Malt Bill. And I'll go first. I'm going to do an easy one here. I'm going to take 3 Pilsners, 3 Pilsner grains.
2 Munich.
And a Munich.
Yeah.
3 of those. Munich. And I'm going to say this is the beer I'm making. I'm going to make a light little Oktoberfest here. Let's see how this tastes.
There's your beer.
And then it's kind of a question, do you like that? Would you want it to be a little more Pilsner-y? Would you want it to be a little more Munich-y? And that's where you can start to kind of develop recipes. And they're going to taste different, obviously, when you brew with them, but it starts to give you an idea. I did this a number of years ago with my alt beer recipe, and we had all the grains out there, and we tasted the exact proportions that go into my alt beer. And then we had the same recipe where we drank the alt beer that night. So you got to taste the raw grains, kind of get that thought in your head, taste the actual beer that was that proportion, and then kind of line up the two. So on your brew day, losing a few grains out of your batch is not going to affect your gravity. Don't get all freaked out about that. But look at your recipe and go, okay, it's this percent that, and taste 10 of them. Or if you need to do the math, you need to taste 20 things to get the 5%ers in there. make a mini taste here. Put your grains together, taste them, get an idea of what you're going to have, and just kind of file that away for later. And then drink your beer. And if you still have some grains left over, throw them in a little baggie, try it again. And you start to get that relationship then of how do my raw ingredients taste in the final product? And the more you do that kind of stuff, the more you taste your ingredients, the more you just start to kind of teach yourself that you can tell from the grains where your beer is going to go. And that's a skill that you can only get through experience.
Leaving that one there, you could see where the C6 or the Munich kind of overwhelmed the rest of the pills.
Certainly.
So, 25% was way too much to use.
Certainly. And now if we were trying to make a really bold Märzen or something, it probably doesn't have enough Munich. But if we were trying to mostly make a Pilsner beer, but we just wanted a little something in there to give it some interest, that was too much. Somebody else make a recipe and we'll try it.
So I just did Brad's black IPA with a little Pilsner, kind of like a 3-to-1 Pilsner and chocolate. Probably needed less chocolate than that. It was a little bitter. Because I've only made one black IPA and I wasn't big on it, on the style, but I had a hard time kind of balancing out getting that color out of there.
I think that's when that midnight wheat first came out. That was one of the other selling points for it.
Yeah, we definitely used midnight wheat in the black IPA we did last weekend because it does give color without giving the harshness of the roasty flavor.
So back to Shelly's point, if Lori, if you got any info on this, I know there's been a lot of use of roasted malts or darker like crystal grains just for color additions. So like when you're sparging.
Yep.
Do you want to talk about that at all, or?
Sure. I think that kind of started with Gordon Strong, or he kind of takes credit for it, that if you start putting too many of these dark grains into your mash and they go through your full mash, they come out a lot harsher and more acrid, bolder than you want. If you're mostly just looking for color, you can mash all your other grains and just throw them in on top. And when you lauter through that, you're going to get the color. You don't have to have them in there for the whole mash. The other thing is there's like Weyermann makes Carafa 123. Those have been dehusked. So those give you the color, but it's the husk giving you like that acrid, dark, that char here on this roasted malt is a lot of it's just coming from the husk. So if they dehusk it before they roast it, it's much smoother. And a lot of German beers throw that in for color. And so instead of trying to go with something roasty, they just want the color. Like a Munich Dunkel is not at all about the roast, it's just about the color. And so those Carafa type 1, 2, 3, and again, those get a little more dark as you go, give you that color without that acrid porter stout thing going on in them.
I'm going to jump in here. That's Carafa Special 1, 2, and 3. Carafa 1, 2, and 3 still has the husk on it.
Good point.
So, Lori was doing shorthand here.
If you at the meeting last month, the guy from Anacortes was talking about staining a beer or dyeing a beer, and that's just essentially what he's talking about is adding a dark grain before you sparge to just get the color out of it.
If you have, I think Gordon Strong has a couple of books. One's like Brewing Better Beer or something along those lines, has a yellow cover. He's got a second one, but when he runs through his process, he very much preaches the whole throw the dark malts in at the end, and he's a huge believer of that one. Anybody else want to make a recipe?
If you do like kind of go that route though, keep in mind that, it's not a 1-to-1 translation. So if you have your favorite porter that's a little acrid and you decide to throw those grains in at the top of the mash, it's not going to come out the same. You're going to need to bump it up a little bit because it's not going to have the same extraction. So,
yeah.
right, so we did one. We did 5 of the pale, 2 of the Munich, 2 of the roasted, and 1 of the caramel 60. This is similar to our CDA.
Yeah, this is our black IPA, basically.
Run through that one more time, Ray. You had 5 pale.
5 of the pale, 2 of the Munich, 2 of the roasted, 1 of the Crystal Malt 60.
5, 2, and 1.
Yep, 5, 2, 2, and 1.
5, 2, 2, and 1.
Very
And
simple to this.
This is
Similar to
our this is our CD8.
How many crystal did you throw in there? 1.
And then it's got a bunch of hops in it.
Ah,
Very roasty,
Yeah.
toasty.
it's roasty. Now what? I like that.
That's pretty good.
I like that. There's a good amount of sweetness. Like the roastiness kind of hit me right at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then it really just kind of mellows out and gets real sweet and levels off at the end.
It's one of our favorites.
I definitely like it. One of my favorites.
Good.
I like that. We might have to do like a growler swap of that. That's
Well, we
delicious.
have a kind of a fresh keg on, so
For sure.
get
Perfect.
it right fast.
So, Lori,
Hey,
when you were
Ray.
talking, oh,
No,
go ahead,
never
Brad.
mind. No, I was just gonna say, can you just run through those one more time? The grains that you used in that real fast?
So that was 5 of the pale,
Mm-hmm.
2 of the Munich, 2 of the roasted, and 1 of the Crystal 60.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
So I don't know if Todd just turned off his camera, or if he disappeared, but he wanted me to talk about, there's all these like foam, carafoam malts and crazy malts out there that are supposed to do all kinds of things for you. There's malt that will help acidify your mash if you have trouble with that. There's malts that will just help build head, adding protein. I would just do like a more beer or Google search if you're trying to get something specific into your beer. Because there's a ton of things out there if you're trying to get slight adjustments through your malt. But definitely malt in there for a little bit of head retention is always good, a little bit of body. I don't really know where to go with that, but I don't think Todd's here to follow up, so I'll let that go.
I would say that there's not a single recipe that, well, there's a few, but they're few and far between that couldn't accept a half pound of carapils just for head retention and
Yeah.
a little bit of malted flavor.
Uh,
I think all the club recipe pale ales we do, we tend to throw just a little hint of wheat in there, again, for body and head retention. Jim probably knows better than I do, but I think is there usually just a little hint of Pilsner in our club pale ale?
I think it was
Pilsner?
I want to say it's like 2 row and then just a little hint of Pilsner, a little hint of wheat. Yeah, we use the same recipe for all these pale ales.
it's like 75% pale, 20% pills, and then 5% wheat. I think it kind of it's close to that tasty pale ale that he'd always make.
Anybody have any malt questions before we take off here?
Lori, this was really, really helpful.
This is very good. Very good.
So good. And now I have like 100 more questions, but I'm like, I just need to read the book. Yeah.
You need to check this out from the library.
Yes.
Ray, you know
Email the
what
librarian at GEBL.org.
Ray, you know what she wants for Christmas.
Yes.
Well, and we have the others. Like I think we have the water, the yeast, and the hops one. I don't know why we don't have them all.
Round out the set.
The malt book is actually pretty readable if you pick your chapters. There's the chapters you know right away you care about, and there's the chapters you're like, yeah, I don't care about this and I never will. Skip those.
Yeah, this was really helpful though. I
Yes,
appreciate it.
thank you.
Yeah, good job, Lori.
Yeah, Lori,
Good
you
job,
answered all my
Lori.
questions. All the questions I had in the beginning, you basically answered all of them. So thank you very much.
You bet.
Okay.
Nice.
I have a question for Jim. I know Laura, you've talked about getting stuff from Jim. Jim, how do I buy stuff from you? Do you have a store?
Oh,
I do.
No,
have
he's
a-
offline anymore. He's quit. He used to be in business, but he quit.
Hang on, hang on.
I'll shut up.
I do have a store. All you have to do is contact me and yeah, send me your recipe and it'll be ready for you.
Okay,
Jim,
and I just pick it up from your house?
Yep.
Okay.
Jim, are you okay if I put your email address in the chat for Tyler?
That would be fine.
Okay, I'll do that right now.
Okay, then
Appreciate
one other thing I'm going to do is if you're looking for a base recipe, well, you're going to try a beer that you haven't done before. I can't say enough good about.
Oh, yes.
We have that book.
That one's also on my Christmas list. so.
It is the place to start with any beer and then start deviating from there as you wish.
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton of all grain and extract recipes in there for every single one. And those are all award-winning recipes. Those are amazing.
Jim, can you hold it up again? Hold it up again.
Brewing classic styles.
Yeah.
Brewing. Okay, got it. Thank you.
There's
And
one more
it's in the
book that's Ray
library.
Daniels that's designing great beers. And that book, it's a little bit dated, but it talks about recipe formulation the way I think about recipe formulation, as like percentages and what you're trying to get out of them. And it's an old school book, but there's a lot of great info in there. And what Ray
That's
did
an
is
amazing book.
he kind of deconstructed award-winning recipes from the NHC competitions for a number of years and was trying to figure out what ingredients people were using in like the award-winning Pilsners and Oktoberfest and all these different styles. And by being dated, it doesn't have the same availability that we do of just gazillions of malts we could possibly have. But the basics are still there and still hold true today, but fantastic way to kind of just think about recipe formulation.
I gotta give props to I'm sorry, Will, real quick. I'm sorry, Jess. So I worked with Brad for the first time, like really ever, and I learned a lot from him. And one of the things I learned from him is that, you go and you find some beer, you go like to a clone recipe and find something similar to what you're trying to make, and then you try to modify it your own way. And then the app that he mentioned was Brewer's Friend. I used other tools, but Brewer's Friend was absolutely phenomenal because it makes sure that you hit all your numbers, your style, your colors. It was excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Does everybody use brewing software to formulate their recipes?
I use Beersmith, but Brewer's Friend was really helpful.
easy.
Do you guys know how to do it by hand?
No.
Used to.
So I'm old. I've been doing this a while. There was no Beersmith. There was no internet. So I know how to do the hand calcs to figure out what my grain bill will do. And then I was a geek, so I wrote a spreadsheet to do the same thing. And then brewing software came out and I'm like, never using that again. But if you do that once, you learn a lot about beer and brewing. If you just plug it into software, you get the answer. But if you're ever bored on a rainy Saturday, try to do it by hand. Do it on the internet. There's all kinds of stuff out there, but it's really interesting to think about how the gravity points from all your ingredients translate to the end result.
I can give a copy of the one I got from Weisweaver when I very first started. He gave me a copy of his grain bill sheet, so I can bring one.
And that Designing Great Beers book actually has a bunch of templates in there on how to do it all by hand. That's where I started out, and you learn how to do it by hand. And like Lori said, it was just so cool to see like a Pilsner recipe and the percentages of people that used what type of grain and when in the process and what kind of hops. And I mean, it was just a ton of information.
I find it to be a really good reality check when you find what you think is a really good recipe on the internet. And it's like, why did they put that much of that grain or that hop in there? And it really kind of helps you come back to reality.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you know about this, the more you catch, if you read brewing magazines, it seems like every issue of a brewing magazine has a correction from the month before because there was a typo. And it's like, did you really mean to put 80 pounds of hops in at the end? Nope. That was supposed to be 8 ounces. Did you really mean to put 4 pounds of roasted malt? Nope. That was 4 ounces. But you catch those stuff just right off the bat if you know your ingredients and you've thought about what that's going to contribute. All at once you're like, that can't be right.
Yep.
I get that quite a bit when people send me a recipe and I'm going, whoa, 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 wait a second. You don't want that much.
So I think also that the Gordon Strong, Lori mentioned the brewing better beer. I think that was kind of the intent, was to update Ray Daniels's approach a little bit. It's another good designing recipe one. It's no designing classic beer styles for sure though, or designing beers or classic beer styles, but it's still pretty good. And since we're talking books, I would put the shameless plug in for this new one that came out. If you just need to read a weird, like, new updated the historical brewing techniques of the farmhouse brewing, would you like to hear Lori's talk about malting and to read about malting, and then just hear what people literally used to do and how, I mean, people would make beer twice a year, you know, and everyone did it. Like they made beer twice a year. It was kind of like, you know, putting up your
like candy on,
putting up your Christmas lights and stuff like that. So it's just got a lot of crazy information in it. It's, you know, you got to be ready to delve into a different type of book, but it's pretty good.
Is Linda still in earshot?
She is here. Yeah.
I had to laugh because I was talking to Linda a couple weeks ago about this talk, and I think I blew her mind with the idea that we let all our little grain start to grow and we give it hope, and then we kill it and we brew with it.
I was like, what happens? This is really depressing.
Well, we do with hops every year, so sure. Yeah.
They're flowers that will eventually die. So
that's right.
Beer, so you know, it lived a good cause.
But another shameless plug for a book was mentioned earlier. Is Jen Talley is known for her session beers because she was in Utah for a long time. So she wrote the session beer book, and she uses a ton of specific grains to give body and flavor to a session beer to trick your mind and your palate that you're drinking like a full-bodied 6.5% IPA when it's like 3.5%. I love that book, and I love doing that with beers. And I've tricked a few of you with some IPAs and stuff too. That you thought was a big beer, and I was like, no, it's like 3%. But that's kind of the power of what Lori said, is the power of malt and how you choose it in the right ways, and the power of it all. So cool. So thank you, Lori. Great info.
Well, thank Jim, because Jim called me one day and said, I got this great idea for a talk. I think we should like taste a bunch of malts, and I think it'd be really cool. And I could put these little malt bags together. I'm like, yeah, that sounds great. He goes, and then I think you should lead the talk.
Yeah.
And I said, yes. So here we are. Not all bad.
Yes. Yeah. Hook, line, and sinker.
Next time Jim gives you a call and says, I've got this great idea, be careful.
Hang up quick.
Yeah.